The air hung heavy over the open ground just beyond London's walls. In 1231, a crowd gathered around a makeshift gallows. There, under royal command, rebellious barons, once proud nobles, faced execution in the field known as Smithfield. It was not the first such event here, and it would be far from the last. What began as a cattle market on the outskirts of the medieval city would, over the centuries, become London's most infamous site of public justice, Smithfield. Smithfield was never meant to be a place of death. Originally an open plain outside the city walls, it served as a space for trade, horse fairs, and even royal tournaments. But from the 13th century onward, its identity began to darken. According to the monk and chronicler Matthew Paris, Smithfield was already associated with executions by the early 1200s. He describes the hanging of barons ordered by the king, a chilling indicator that this public space was becoming an arena for state violence, one where royal authority could be quite literally displayed on a rope. By the early 15th century, Smithfield was no longer a site only for rebels and outlaws. It had become a place where conscience itself could be punished. In 1410, John Badby, a humble craftsman and follower of the Lollard reform movement, was brought to the square for denying the doctrine of transubstantiation. He was locked in a barrel and burned alive. Prince Henry, moved by his bravery, halted the flames and offered him life in exchange for submission. But Badby refused, and the fire was relit. This transformation was not lost on later observers. John Stowe, writing in the late 16th century, described Smithfield bluntly. In this open field of old time stood gallows for the execution of offenders. What once echoed with the clatter of hooves and the cries of merchants now rang with screams and sermons. Fires were lit here too, not for warmth or industry, but for burning heretics. What began as an open field became a ritual space of terror. Smithfield's soil was soaked with the blood of the condemned long before it was paved over by history. The fires of Smithfield, executing heretics in Tudor London. In Tudor London, Smithfield transformed into more than a place of execution. It became a furnace of religious terror. Under Queen Mary I, the site turned into a theatre of flame. Known to Protestants as Bloody Mary, her reign from 1553 to 1558 marked the most infamous wave of heretic burnings in English history. Smithfield, once a market square, became the epicentre of this purge. One of the earliest victims was John Rogers, a Protestant preacher and Bible translator. On the morning of February 4, 1555, he was led to the stake in Smithfield. His wife and children stood among the spectators. According to Fox's Book of Martyrs, Rogers remained calm, even defiant. As the flames rose, he washed his hands in the flame as though it had been cold water. It was not just an execution, it was a statement, one that haunted those who saw it. But Rogers was only the beginning. The burnings continued weekly. The Londoner Henry Machin, who recorded events in his diary, described one particularly brutal day in July 1555. A man and a woman burned together in Smithfield. He wrote simply but powerfully, "The cry of the people was great against the cruelty." In these few words, the emotional fracture within the city is exposed. Loyalty to the crown clashed with sympathy for the condemned. The flames of Smithfield were not only literal, they were symbolic. Each execution was framed as a moral necessity. Sermons were preached, crowds were summoned, and always the fire followed. The gallows at Smithfield, public hangings before the crowds. It began with the hammering of timber, not for shelter or trade, but for death. In the heart of medieval London, officials erected gallows in the broad expanse of Smithfield, where livestock once traded hands and royal tournaments dazzled the masses. These new wooden frames had a single purpose: to suspend the condemned before the eyes of the city. Justice here would hang in the air. The decision was deliberate. According to 14th century City of London records, gallows were to be made in the field of Smithfield for hanging malefactors. It was a civic project, commissioned, authorised and maintained. Public execution had become public policy, and Smithfield, with its wide, accessible ground just outside the city walls, became a stage for state violence. The message was unmistakable. Crime would not be punished in shadow, but displayed in daylight. Thomas Walsingham, a chronicler writing from nearby St Albans Abbey, recorded one such moment in 1382. In the wake of the peasants' revolt, a line of men, branded rebels, were marched to Smithfield and hanged amid the cries of the common people. The crowd had gathered not only to witness justice, but to participate in it. Some shouted approval, others wept or recoiled, but all watched. Excavations near West Smithfield have uncovered skeletal remains with neck fractures consistent with hanging trauma. No names are attached, no epitaphs carved, but the bones tell a silent truth. Smithfield's role as a killing ground was not just legend, it is etched into the earth. In Smithfield, punishment was never just a consequence, it was a performance. Drawn and quartered, treason's deadly price. The sound of iron wheels on stone echoed through London as the condemned was dragged towards Smithfield. This was not a criminal bound for a simple execution. It was a traitor, and for treason, English law demanded nothing short of annihilation. In the eyes of the Crown, betrayal wasn't merely a crime. It was an assault on the king himself. And at Smithfield, that insult was answered with the most brutal sentence the realm could carry out. Since the 13th century, the punishment for high treason had been fixed in law. The condemned would be drawn to the place of execution, hanged until near death, then subjected to further punishment that deliberately dismantled the body and legacy of the accused. It was as much a spectacle as it was a sentence, designed to obliterate rebellion in both flesh and spirit. In 1305, William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter who defied King Edward I, was brought to Smithfield. His execution was meant to end not just a man, but a movement. According to the Scala Chronica, a 14th century chronicle, Wallace was drawn from the tower to the elms at Smithfield, hanged, and his members divided. 2 decades later, in 1326, another man would suffer the same fate on the same ground. Hugh Despenser the Younger, the hated favourite of King Edward II, was captured following the rebellion led by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer. His sentence was issued with ceremonial precision. Each step of the sentence was performed not in haste, but with ritual. Smithfield's crowds witnessed not only a death, but the kingdom's assertion of power, physical, legal and symbolic. Despenser's remains were dispersed across the country, a final act of fragmentation to mirror his betrayal. By this time, Smithfield had become more than a marketplace or execution ground. It was a theatre of state vengeance. When the sentence of hanging, drawing and quartering was pronounced, it was not merely to punish, it was to erase, to dismantle treason so thoroughly that no piece of it would survive. In the open fields of Smithfield, kings silenced their enemies, not behind walls, but before the eyes of a city. And in that visibility lay the true purpose of the punishment, not just to kill the traitor, but to teach the crowd what loyalty truly cost. The executions at Smithfield were never random acts of cruelty. They were public rituals of power, engineered to instill fear, enforce obedience, and erase defiance. Over centuries, this killing ground became a mirror of England's shifting soul, where kings crushed rebellion, where martyrs met flames, and where the crowd was never just a witness, but part of the performance. And yet, where bodies once fell, coins now trade hands. Comment below. Is Smithfield's transformation proof of historical progress, or simply a burial of memory beneath brick and commerce? In this open field, stood Gallows for the execution of offenders. Now it is a market for horses and cattle. John Stow, Survey of London, 1598.